I thought you had it done.
Messieurs, comment allez-vous? And that's about the extent of it on my part. My name is Jerry Remy. I'm the sexton of the cemetery and the secretary and the treasurer and a few other things. My son John and I mow the cemetery when needed, and we have trimmed a little bit extra for today's presentation. Can you hear me okay back there? Okay. So it's, I welcome you, and you're here for, not for a funeral.
All right.
Good show. Let me give you a little history of the cemetery. As rumor has it, or the story goes, and this is from my grandfather who lived forever, he indicated that in the early 1870s, at the wake of a fellow Frenchman, who that was I'm not sure, the French community decided that they should have a cemetery of their own, because many of the people living in this immediate area were being buried in the Belleville Cemetery, which of course is non-sectarian. And at this time there was a cemetery down by St. James Church in Dayton, but the fact that the French community was pretty much in this area, they said, okay, let's have our own cemetery. So Eugene Piernot, whose grave you're resting on, he owned the farm to this direction. Right now it's owned by the Stussies, but the Piernots owned this particular land, and he said, well, I've got an acre that you can, the quote is, you can have, but then some of the other Frenchmen indicated that they paid him $25. So anyway, that's how this particular parcel came to be. And relatively soon, in the mid to late 1870s, various people ended up being buried here. But actually, it wasn't really plotted out officially until into the 1900s. But anyway, you'll see some grave markings that are like an 1870-something, 1880-something, and so forth. So people were being buried here on a pretty regular basis. Prior to that time, I referred to the fact that burials were done sometimes on the home farm, but oftentimes in the Belleville Cemetery. So when they finally decided to do this cemetery, they had a project to exhume the bodies that had already been buried, as many as they could find, and made a decision to do, and wagon load after wagon load of remains, they weren't cremains then, came to the cemetery. There was a common grave dug along the west edge of the property, and those remains were placed in there. My great-grandma Francois, some of her relatives were buried along that far edge in a common grave. And the stones that you see in that corner, many of them were brought over from the Belleville Cemetery and placed in those plots in that corner. The story goes that when Fred Vinny, whose monument is up there by, I don't know what, there's a basket hanging up there, he's right on the edge, when his grave was dug, and they were still digging graves 6 feet deep at that time, they presumably came through or dug through some bones. So that's almost verification that that common grave was and still is there. So many of the early French people, the Larocques, the Tizarans, and their kin, and over in the corner is a double-faced marker. One side is for the Cartrins, old Joe Cartrin, the father of Francis, and also the father of Mrs. Xavier Garvel, because they came when they came from France. And on the other side is Victory Garvel, who was Xavier's mother, and she, for whatever reason, didn't have a husband. So that's where Xavier took her name. That's that last tombstone-looking tombstone over there in the corner. The cemetery initially was called Saint Celestin, and it's sometimes called Saint Celestial, and sometimes called the Frenchtown Cemetery. And that name prevailed on some of the burial certificates that I have up into the early 1920s. So officially in about 1927, with the blessings of the bishop, whoever he was at the time, we became known as St. Raphael's. And that name derives from, I believe, a parish that was west of Pioli, the early parish that was over there, and I think that parish, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, was called St. Raphael's. So anyway, it's officially St. Raphael's Frenchtown Cemetery. And so we continue in that respect. I've got the little cheat notes here. There's so many stories that, and I'm sure I'll forget some, but okay, we did the one grave I want to mention is the one that's kind of nestled in the lilac bushes over there. That grave is for Félicité Petito. She came in 1856. The story is that en route from Milwaukee, she was riding on a wagon, the men were following on foot, and they went over a log. This is my grandfather's story, but whatever. Anyway, she was flipped off and she broke her neck. And she died in the story goes, the next day. I question that a little bit because her death date is like December 27th. And when people left France, they didn't leave to arrive in the winter in Wisconsin. So there's a little discrepancy there, but it's still an interesting story. And the monument is in French on one side and in English on the other. And she was the wife of, I know it so well, I've trimmed around it all the time. Anyway, her husband. So one side is in French, and one side is in English. And it's hollow. It's a hollow metal marker. It's the only one in the cemetery. As we would work up the road, if you want to come this way, and we'll just kind of hit a few more stories. The one that you're going by on the right, the Fleury Stone, Eugene died when he was 48 years old, I believe, and that was a farm accident. His wife went on to remarry, which was oftentimes the case when one of the spouses would pass, the other one would remarry and probably have children with the new husband. So there's a lot of their kids and my kids type of arrangement. Charlie Vinny is a good example of that. Right here, this large stone. Charlie's first wife was Mary, who was a daughter of Felician Pillar and his wife. And she passed. Her stone is right here. And then he turned around and married Mary Fleury. And you'll notice that Fleury is spelled with an EY, which is the way they spelled it in France. And Marie had been married before too. So here we've got her kids, his kids from our first marriage, and then they went on to have even more children. So it's a constant fun and games with, no television. So a fair number of children prevailed. Back in the first stone that you came by, Aristide Genin, one of the three Genin brothers that came with their father, whose stone is right up here. Aristide and his wife had, I maintain 14 kids, but the story is they had 13. But I think truly there was 14, and I believe one passed at birth. So, and the story goes that Mrs. Aristide Genin was out shocking grain during one of her pregnancies, and she was about due because they had a midwife in the house. And apparently her water broke. Into the house she went, gave birth, and as the story goes, she was out doing chores again the following morning. So with 13 kids, it probably was kind of routine, And those 13 kids, I believe, all lived to adulthood. Okay, we'll work our way back up. An early Fleury stone, an early Tudo stone, August Tudo. The Tudos initially had property in Exeter Township, along with the LaRock family. And this goes back to the fact that John Roy, if you've read anything about Frenchtown history, John Roy came to America, I believe in 1835, settled in Schenectady, New York, and then with the onset of the Mexican War, he was either drafted or joined, and he, by the way, his wife was Cecile Tudo. So anyway, he served in the Mexican War. Upon release, he, like a lot of the other soldiers, had land grants for being in the war. So he probably buddied up with somebody from Wisconsin, and as a result, took his land grant into Montrose or maybe Exeter. And I'm thinking, we don't find his records anywhere on the plat maps, but I have a hunch that he probably had the land in Exeter where his Tudo brother-in-law then ended up owning the property. Un momento, por favor. John moved on to the Reedsburg area and bought land by Casanova, ended up growing hops, which was really popular in those years. In fact, he hired a number of the French people in the fall to come and help pick hops, because that was a pretty thriving business for him. He's buried at the cemetery in Casanova with a rather substantial stone, he and his wife Cecile. But meanwhile, the Tudos are living here. These people, as they came, first probably 4 or 5 or 6 families, for the most part sent word back to their other relatives in France, telling about the land. You can get 80 acres for X number of dollars, da 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 da. And so you had like 2, if not 3 waves of immigration from France to this greater Frenchtown region. And if you looked at any of the maps there in the building this morning and this afternoon, you can see how they all kind of joined together. For the most part, it wasn't the greatest farmland, but they worked together very conveniently. The Francis family came early in 1850s, some of them. Then they went back to France and brought a few more over, and then they went back to France again and brought a few more over. The last batch came over with Delphine Francis. Meanwhile, August was already here, his other brother. And when they came, they also brought Grandma Francis, Elizabeth, who is buried in that common grave. Elizabeth apparently brought the money from the sale of the property in France. But the bill of sale in France indicated that if she didn't like it in America, she could go back and reclaim her property. So that was actually written out. This is according to Solange Perisseau, one of our French correspondents, who has since passed. So anyways, these 2 brothers, August, Delphine, and then their sister Josephine, who was my great-grandmother, Mrs. August Remy, owned 80-acre parcels, all 3 of them. They all adjoined themselves right over in that area. When they got the property paid off, they each acquired their 80 acres. And I don't know if I'm going to lose it here or not. Vodka. I should say vodka. So anyway, that's another story as to how they worked as communes, or kind of a cooperative, and it wasn't just between the Francises, but the other French families as well. The Freeland stone over here has umpteen children listed on the back. And Allie, the one that has the cross on it, died as a young girl, I think in late teens or early 20s. And on her stone it says she was born in East Belleville, because that was the better side of town. So we'll move on, but we won't move up too high because I think that's where the Skeeters are. The Piernots were very early in arrival. Okay, right here on your right is the patriarch of the Jenin stone, right behind our video people. So Louis Joseph Jenin, they came in 1856. The Petitos, the lady that fell off the wagon, She was a kin to the Jennings, and she came at the same time, and along with a few other people. All of my wife and I and a few of you folks who have kicked in some dollars over the past few years, we replaced Joseph's stone in a similar manner to what the original marble one looked like, because it was broken in half and laying on the ground. So this is kind of a genealogical stone. It not only reflects Louis Joseph, but also his wife, who has a separate stone next to it, but and it tells where they came from and when. And then on the back, and you might want to take a look, it lists all of their children, which I have a record from the French records. And they all had double names. And Aristide, for example, was, I think, Celestin Aristide. And so they went by one of the two names, baptismal names or whatever. But it's a resurrection of an early stone of which my wife and I are kin to, and we opted to create a new stone for it. So it turned out pretty well. The Favor family, which is another early one, is on the far side. That's Charlie Favor, and I think his parents are over on this side someplace. Yeah, right there. So some of the old marble stones are the older stones, of course, and marble comes in varying degrees of hardness. Some of them really erode with acid rain. Some hang in there really well. What I find, if I have to read the inscription on any of these, I take a putty knife and scrape off the lichen or moss, and then I spray it with shaving cream. Then I have can't think of it, squeegee, a squeegee, and I pull it down off the shaving cream, and all those letters just pop out, bingo. And so you just have a bucket of water there to rinse off the stone. So if you're ever out in the cemetery and you want to do that, that's one of the neatest ways of reading one of these old stones. Up on the hill we have some newer graves. The two Lambley brothers, Gus Lambley's brothers, Art and, help me out Lambley's, Art, Joey, right, okay, thank you. Art and Joey Lambley married Dish sisters, Dish. And so they have 4 graves right over there amongst those Fitzer junipers. And some of the other kinfolk from the Lambley family is buried up there as well. My grandfather, Jules Remy, is right here. He came from France in 1866, right after the Civil War, because his brother-in-law came back to France and gathered the rest of the Francis clan. So he came over as a child of 2 or 3, and he lived to be 103. So he did the sailing ship, he did the railroad, he did small airplanes, he did jets. He got the telephone, the radio, and he always talked to the people on television as if they were right there. So anyway, he really lived a span of changes in